Yelena smiled shyly. She wanted to come back. Yelena's parents, excuse me. Yelena's parents divorced when she was small, but they had taken her to church until she was 5. Then they had gotten tired of seeing each other in church and quit going to church altogether. Yelena went to public school and had classes 6 days a week, from Monday through Saturday. As soon as school ended at 1, the next Sabbath, Yelena immediately returned to church. She didn't understand the sermon, but she tried to make sense of it. She liked being in church where she used to worship as a small girl. She liked being among the other children in the church. After a while, she started skipping classes at school so she could go to church earlier on Sabbath. A month passed, and she invited her older sister, Oksana, to go with her. Oksana, who was 13, agreed, and the two went together. Then Mother noticed that Yelena and Oksana were going to church, and she started going with them. But then some church children moved away with their parents. Other children stopped going to church. Then Mother stopped going to church. Yelena also stopped going every Sabbath. A church member noticed Yelena's absence and asked her to help with the sound system. Yelena agreed, and now she had to go to church every Sabbath because church members needed her. As she went, she also began reading the Bible and books by Ellen White regularly. She especially grew fond of the Great Controversy. Mother saw that Yelena liked Sabbath school and was making good friends with the adults in the church. She started going to church again. After communion service one Sabbath, Mother asked Yelena a serious question. Do you want to be baptized? Yelena already thought about it, and she immediately said she wanted to give her heart to Jesus. Yelena took baptismal classes and was baptized. The water in the baptismal tank was terribly cold, but a warm joy flooded over her when she came out of the water. She had made the best decision of her life. She had given her heart to Jesus. Yelena never went to school on Saturday again. Mother wrote a note to the principal asking for Yelena to be excused from Saturday classes so she could worship God. The school gave her permission, but Yelena also had to make up Saturday schoolwork, and she struggled to make good grades. Today, Saturday's schoolwork was no longer a problem. After that school year, Yelena learned about Zaoski Christian School, an Adventist day and boarding school located about 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers away from her hometown. She couldn't afford to pay tuition, but a church member offered to help. Today, she is 16 years old in 11th grade. It is awesome to study here, she said. The teachers are kind and they help me with my studies. I am very glad we don't have classes on Saturday. The Sabbath school offering this quarter on 13th Sabbath goes to help build a school of their own so they can have their own classes and not have to go to the university for their classes. So offering will be taken up in church. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, let's have a moment of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this new day. Thank you for a Sabbath day. Thank you that we can come here and worship. Thank you that we have materials prepared so we can study some things and learn some things and spend this time together productively. Please be with us and bless us, I pray in Jesus' name, amen. The defeat of the Assyrians. Guess we can't get those two confused if we're careful. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim, you are God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. Isaiah 37:16, which comes from Hezekiah's prayer, pointing out to God that he's in charge. A gaunt man walks barefoot with his two sons. Another family has loaded all their belongings onto an ox cart pulled by emaciated oxen. A man leads the oxen while two women sit on the cart. The less fortunate people have no cart. They carry their possessions on their shoulders. Soldiers are everywhere. A battering ram smashes into the city gate. Archers on top of the ram shoot at defenders on the walls. Hectic carnage reigns supreme. It's hard to imagine living in a fenced city, a city with walls, thinking you're fairly safe, and then having someone come along and brutally point out that it's still not safe. And fast forward the other end of the walk. A king sits grandly on his throne, receiving booty and captives. Some captives approach him with their hands upraised, pleading for mercy. Others kneel or crouch. Descriptions of these scenes with the king begin with these words: Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, and continue with such expressions as sat in a Nemidu throne, and the booty of the city, Lachish, passed in review before him. Written by Malcolm Russell on The Writing on the Wall. This series of pictures, which once adorned the walls of Sennacherib's palace without a rival, are now in the British Museum, and what a story they have to tell about the plight of God's professed people. Sunday starts off with some texts out of 2 Kings and Chronicles and a little bit in Isaiah. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did King Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria, to Lachish, saying, I have offended, return from me that which thou puttest on me will I bear. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So the first step of King Sennacherib was to say, okay, well, if you pay me off, I'll go away. But then he didn't. After these things, and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and camped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. And then in Isaiah 36:1 it says, Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them. Any thoughts? When faithless Ahaz died and his faithful son Hezekiah succeeded him, Hezekiah inherited a kingdom that had lost full independence. Having purchased Assyrian aid against the alliance of Syria and northern Israel, Judah was forced to continue paying protection money in the form of tribute to Assyria. And when the Assyrian king Sargon II died on a distant battlefield and was succeeded by Sennacherib in 705 BC, Assyria appeared vulnerable. Evidence from Assyrian and biblical texts reveal that Hezekiah seized this opportunity to rebel, taking aggressive action as the ringleader of an anti-Assyrian revolt among the small nations in the region. Unfortunately for him, Hezekiah had underestimated the resilience of Assyria's might, and in 701 BC, when Sennacherib had subdued other parts of his empire, he remembered Judah. He lashed out against Syria and Palestine with devastating force and ravaged Judah. So then it asks in our lesson, how did Hezekiah prepare for a confrontation with Assyria? I didn't run across an awful lot of thoughts to raise as questions in the middle of this, but if you have thoughts or questions to raise in the middle of this, please feel free to do so. Goes to 2 Chronicles 32, 1 through 8.
We should probably use the microphones so that everybody can hear them.
That would be good.
The nice thing about Hezekiah was he's a good Adventist. Faith and works. Trust and obey. He didn't just pray and trust. He put his actions into his faith. And so, yeah, he did. That Hezekiah's tunnel. People walk through it these days. It was, why should the Assyrians have water? So they made Hezekiah's tunnel so that that water tunnel so that they would have water, and it wouldn't be interrupted by the Assyrians' disruption. And he rebuilt the wall. So I just heard that the wall was better for Jerusalem because it was a double wall. That way that if they built ramps up to tear down the first wall, they would be just faced with another wall, and they would be prime targets for the defenders. So anyway, I thought that was interesting.
We have to take into account that the people of Israel had to give in tithes and offerings near 30% of their money or of their entrances. If in addition to that, they have to pay a foreign king, a foreign country, more than that, it was too heavy for the peoples who were overcome. And so Hezekiah took the decision not to pay any more to the king of Assyria for the mistake of his father Ahaz. And it was really a dangerous decision, but he decided to trust the Lord because the Lord brought them to the promised land to make them free from foreign nations and to worship freely to the Lord. Under these circumstances, the King Hezekiah had to deal with a problem that he inherited from his father, who didn't believe in the God of Israel, or he didn't care. So we have different kind of leadership in Israel. Ahaz and now Hezekiah, who wanted to be faithful. Could we have also in our church a similar problem between different leaders, a former president and after another president? Are they perfect? Was Hezekiah faithful his whole life, I think that we will have always to deal with a human problem, human weaknesses, and we have to trust the Lord that can work anyway through us in order to fulfill his purposes.
Amen.
Yes, that's certainly true. It's hard for me to get a very accurate picture of, I mean, I haven't read history books on this time, so I'm not really up on just what the chain of events were, but we know that the kings of Israel were routinely going back to idolatry and occasionally coming back to God, and so they were also then more likely to make pacts with their neighbors, either for protection or to be protected from someone else. It must have been a pretty chaotic world. 2 Chronicles 32:1-8 says, "After these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib king of Assyria came and entered into Judah, encamped against the fenced cities, and thought to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come, and that he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes, his mighty men, to stop the waters of the fountains which were without the city, and they did help him. So there was gathered much people together, who stopped all the fountains and the brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water? Also he strengthened himself and built up all the wall that was broken, and raised it up to the towers, and another wall without, and repaired Milo in the city of David, and made darts and shields in abundance. And he set captains of war over the people, and gathered them together to him in the street of the gate of the city, and spake comfortably, saying, Be strong and courageous, be not afraid nor dismayed for the king of Assyria, not for all the multitude that is with him, for there be more with us than with him." Almost like he saw the fighting men of God on the hillside, like the prophet's servant did one day. "With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah king of Judah. It is interesting, as was brought up, that Hezekiah did everything within his power to be prepared to protect his city, and yet he recognized at the same time that he needed God's help, or he was going to have serious trouble anyway. And I think that's a good illustration and example for us, especially as men, that we recognize that our families are our responsibility to protect, to provide for, to find the resources, to make a way to make things happen, and yet we also have to acknowledge that we are sometimes baffled as to how to go about that, or sometimes thwarted by circumstances beyond our control. And so, one way or another, we're still at the mercy of God to help us do the manly thing, aren't we? And to provide for our families. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib intended to take Jerusalem, the capital city, he made extensive preparations for a confrontation with Assyria, strengthened fortifications, equipped and organized his army, increased the security of Jerusalem's water supply. The remarkable Siloam water tunnel, commemorated by an inscription, is telling how it was constructed, almost certainly dates to Hezekiah's preparation for a potential siege. And just as important as military and organizational leadership, Hezekiah provided spiritual leadership as he sought to boost the morale of his people at this frightening time. But the king of Judah had determined to do his part in preparing to resist the enemy, and having accomplished all that human ingenuity and energy could do, he had assembled his forces and had exhorted them to be of good courage. So the end of the lesson for Sunday asks the question, if Hezekiah trusted the Lord so much, why did he put out so much effort on his own? Did his works negate his faith? And then it looks at Philippians 2:12 and 13 related to that. Which we usually apply in a little different setting. It says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more, in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Now I think maybe that second line does apply. For God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So when a godly man sets out to defend his home or his city, he sets out with the understanding that he's asked God to be with him. And so while it's still important on a daily basis, and maybe even more often than that, to seek God's protection and God's guidance in the decisions we make, I think that also we can rest in a certain amount of comfort and assurance that if we're putting God in charge of our lives, that we can trust that we're going to move forward in ways that are pleasing to him. It's a tricky thing because I don't want to get in a position of walking away from God in a matter of doing what I think I want to do. And on the other hand, I don't want to live my life walking around in fear at every step that I don't pray over the next little thing and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one throughout my day, that somehow I'm going to mess it up. There's some balance to that. But I'm grateful that we have the Bible text, for instance, that says, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives, impartially, and don't let that man waver in his faith that he got what he asked for, because if he wavers, well, then he can't get what he asked for. I find that encouraging because it's telling me that if I'm going to step out in faith, I better stick with it. That if I've asked for wisdom, I need to believe I'm getting it, and then I need to just move forward trusting that I am getting it, even though I continue to ask God for it. And I'm encouraged by the other text that says all things work together for good to them that love God, because then when I feel like I might not be doing it right, but I really don't have a lot of evidence, but maybe something didn't go the way I planned, but then on the other hand, I'm not sure what I did wrong, I don't have to just feel like I did do something wrong because it didn't go the way I wanted it to. Many times things go different than we want them to, and sometimes our decisions that we make are made honestly, and we did the best we could, and still somebody doesn't appreciate it too much. And although I'd be the first person to be willing to apologize for someone feeling bad about my behavior, there are times when I apologize for how they feel. But I don't necessarily apologize for what I decided, because I believe I made the right choice. Monday's lesson moves on to propaganda. This is kind of interesting. The rulers of Assyria were not only brutal, they were also intelligent. They said, hey, we're beating up this city over here, something awful, and you're next. You want to, give in now while it's early in the process? Their goal was wealth and power, not simply destruction. Why use resources to take a city by force if you can persuade its inhabitants to surrender? So while he was engaged in the siege of Lachish, which he was pretty proud about, Sennacherib sent his representative, a kind of high officer, to take Jerusalem by propaganda. Had enough propaganda for 1 year yet? Our world seems to like to give us a lot of propaganda, and how do you know what to believe? And the king Sennacherib was no different. It says in Isaiah 36, just a few of these verses, I'm not going to read them all, and the king of Assyria sent his Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And Rabshakeh said unto them, say ye now to Hezekiah, thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein thou trusteth? I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom dost thou trust, that thou rebellest against me? Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, their former alliance, whereon if a man leads on it, it will go into his hand and pierce. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all that trust in him. But thou say to me, we trust in the Lord our God. If thou say to me that, it is not he. Is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, ye shall worship before this altar? He was doing that for the people on the wall. What was he trying to tell them?
You can't trust your leaders.
Yeah. Your king tore down your God's altars. Your problem is your king. I'm not your problem. God sent me to straighten him out. You should go back to your idolatry. What were you thinking? Yes, sir.
Yes, the people of Israel were between the king of the south and the king of the north, and sometimes they had within the people those who thought that they have to look for support of the king of the south, Egypt, or to surrender to the king of Assyria in this case. We have today a similar situation in different countries when even in our church many believe that we have to adopt communism, or others believe that we have to adopt capitalism. We are in between two great powers, and we have to trust the Lord. And this is what Hezekiah tried to do. The king of Assyria tried to convince the people that they cannot follow their little God, because the kings of Assyria had the best gods, the greatest gods. In the ancient world, the war was not simply between the two armies, but between the gods of different people. And now the defiance came against the God of Israel. And the Lord used to show his power in the midst of human weaknesses. When we feel weak, we are strong, said the Apostle Paul, because the Lord works through us with his power. And we have to learn this, because the end of the world is coming, and we will have to face many things that we don't like to face, but this will come according to what the Lord told us, and we have to learn to trust the Lord over any kind of politician, Trump, Biden, no matter who. We have to trust the Lord, and he will guide his people to the last triumph.
Amen.
So this Rabshakeh made some rather powerful arguments, trying to wear them down, trying to get them to distrust their God and their king. There were other Bible stories we've read where, and I can't remember the name of the specific situation now, but where, the forces showed up to the gate of the city and said, hey, is so-and-so inside your city? Yeah, he's here. Well, if you know what's good for you, you're going to toss some piece of him out over top of the wall. So they did. I mean, you can't be too surprised if maybe Sennacherib's representative was hoping that there would be enough of an insurrection as a result of his words to cause something similar to happen, if nothing else. And fortunately for Hezekiah, he had enough control of his situation to avoid being one of those people. You cannot trust Egypt to help you because she is weak. You cannot depend on the Lord to help you because Hezekiah has offended him. To avoid a siege in which you have nothing to eat and drink, give up now and you will be treated well. Hezekiah cannot save you, and because the gods of the other countries conquered by Assyria have not saved them, you can be sure your God won't save you either. So is he telling the truth? Not all of it. He filled it in with some things that were true, didn't he? Because there was much truth in what he was saying, his arguments were persuasive. Backing him up were two unspoken arguments. First, he had just come from Lachish, only 30 miles away, where the Assyrians were showing what happens to a strongly fortified city that dares to resist them. Second, he had a powerful contingent of the Assyrian army with him. Knowing the fate of armies and cities elsewhere, including Samaria, the capital of northern Israel, that had succumbed to Assyria, no Judahite would have reason to doubt that from a human point of view, Jerusalem was doomed. The Rabshakeh also was right in saying that Hezekiah had destroyed various places of sacrifice in order to centralize worship at the temple in Jerusalem. But had this reform offended the Lord, who was the only hope his people had left, and would he and could he save them? And this was up to God to answer this question. So have you ever been in a situation where everything seems hopeless? How many times have I come to the Lord and said, you know, I'd consider turning somewhere else if there was anywhere else to turn, but I don't see anything. I'm not really crazy about the path I'm stuck with. I'm not real crazy about what you're letting me go through. But I'm quite certain the alternative isn't going to be any better, so I'm just here talking to you. Because there's nowhere else to go. And that's kind of where the Israelites were. But then they had something more than all of the nations around them, didn't they? They had a history. They had a culture that was set up for them to recognize in their worship services and in their customs that their God had already done many great things for them. And so unlike the person outside of this building that may not know God very well, do we have circumstances in our lives that God has done something for us with so that we have something to look back on? I hope so. I hope that we can look back and say, well, I wouldn't want to cross the same path or head down the same path I started on, but I'm sure glad I'm to where I'm at. Some point in the past wasn't nearly as palatable. And I can thank God for that I've moved on.
Just a couple of things. Can we believe that God knows the future and that He cares about our future?
Tuesday's lesson moves on to shaken but not forsaken. How did the clever oratory of the Rabshakeh affect Hezekiah and his officials? It says in Isaiah 37:1, and it came to pass when Hezekiah heard it that he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, unto Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos. So he headed to the house of the Lord, but he sent some representatives to the prophet. And they said to the prophet, thus saith Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and of rebuke and of blasphemy, for the children are come to birth, and there is not strength enough to bring forth. Mother and child might just die in this situation because there just isn't enough life force to make this work. It may be the Lord thy God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria his master hath sent to reproach the living God, and reprove the words which the Lord thy God hath heard. Wherefore lift up thy prayer for the remnant that is left. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. Shaken to the core and mourning in distress, Hezekiah turned to God, humbly seeking the intercession of Isaiah, the prophet whose counsel his father had ignored. One thing God seems to like quite a bit is when you honor his prophets. God doesn't care too much when we dishonor his prophets.
That's oddly the reverse we find in Daniel, where the grandson didn't like God, was shot down, but Nebuchadnezzar had honored God.
Yes, well, in Israel it kept going back and forth, didn't it? And so then we have God's response. And Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall ye say unto your master, Thus saith the Lord, Be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will set a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. That's a pretty nice response for having the courage to be honorable to the prophet and abase yourself in the church. The message was brief, but it was enough. God was on the side of his people. Isaiah predicted that Sennacherib would hear a rumor that would distract him from his attack on Judah. This was immediately fulfilled. Temporarily frustrated, but by no means giving up for long, Sennacherib sent Hezekiah a threatening message. Do not let your God on whom you rely deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into my hand, the king of Assyria. Have the gods of the nations deliver them? And this time Hezekiah went straight to the temple and spread his message out before the Lord of hosts. And Hezekiah prayed unto the Lord, saying, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, thou dwellest between the cherubims. Thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Incline thine ear, O Lord, and hear. Open thine eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all nations in their countries, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord, even thou only. It has some surprising parallels to the words of David in front of Goliath, doesn't it? So that all the world, the nations, may know that there is a God in Israel, I'm going to kill you, Goliath. It's the same message. A little bit different, but different circumstances. But it's still the leader putting God in charge and believing in him. So there was a lot at stake here, wasn't there?
We're told that Elijah's message will come forth at the end too. If God is God, follow him. If the world is God, follow them.
This is like the plagues on Egypt were designed to show how powerless the gods of the Egyptians were over Israel's God. I would imagine that in those days, that whichever country conquered the other the victorious country's gods were more powerful than the conquered country's gods. And so the plagues on Egypt were designed to show the impotence of the, and of course they were at best you could say there were demons behind them, but they weren't really gods.
Right.
The situation here is that what's at stake is how powerful is God? Is a mere human being claiming in his arrogance that he's more powerful than all gods? From his standpoint, being a pagan king, claiming arrogance over the God of Israel, claiming to be more powerful than the God of Israel, that there was, what was at stake was God's reputation. And so that's, I mean, it's like with the Elijah Mount Carmel experience. God was asked to show that he was God, truly God. And so God answered Elijah's prayer, and the sacrifices were consumed by fire. Here, God's reputation was also at stake. So,
when I was 9 or 10 years old, I participated in my first fast that the General Conference at that time requested to the whole church for what was happening in Colombia. Some pastors had been killed. Our church was closed and our members were persecuted by an intolerant Catholic first minister. And I remember how I was impressed by the fact that the next day, Sunday, we heard that that first minister died unexpectedly, and freedom took place for our church there. So the Lord may also work today. We have to put our trust in the Lord. In the prayer of Hezekiah, we can see that Hezekiah was not saying, Lord, do this so all the peoples of the earth may know that we are right.
Oh no. Oh no.
He said, so all the peoples of the earth could see that you have power, that you are the only God, and the other gods cannot be trusted because they are the production of demons and human beings. But the Lord of Israel can be trusted, and we have to trust the Lord.
Yes. So Sennacherib had pointedly attacked Hezekiah's strongest defense, their faith in their God. And rather than buckle under, Hezekiah appealed to God to demonstrate who he is, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. This weekend, starting Thursday night, last night, and all day today, I'm missing 12 hours, not all 12 hours, it's 12 hours today, I'm missing part of it. In the city of Cleveland, Tennessee, just up the road from us, the Cleveland Ministers Network, in partnership with an organization especially interested in reformation and rehabilitation of whole communities through the power of God, are having a training event teaching what are the principles of calling God into a place to receive the healing of our land. they tell about some native Indian people in Canada that had no elk. A place for the elk, where the elk normally found their food, things weren't working well. The elk had left. They had reached a point where they recognized things were bad. And so they decided to turn to the Lord. And the elk returned. There's an island nation that on this one particular island especially, the water that flowed down the mountains and into the ocean was toxic. It had become toxic for whatever reason. And you could tell when the water went by your part of the village that the grass died because the water was so toxic. So they got together and they said, we've got to do something. Our reef outside of our village out in the ocean is dying. We're not bringing in fish to eat. We're not seeing fish in our streams. We are in a catastrophic circumstance. And so they started coming to the realization things were bad. And now would be a good time to do something about it. So they cried out to God. They had some help with some people that came in that helped them understand the steps. They cried out to God. And I saw pictures Thursday night of the fish swimming in their creeks. And the crab that was that big around out of their reef that they were going to cook for supper, that they were more than delighted to have because God had healed their reef. And the whole village, the whole community is experiencing God, and they cannot refute it because they cried out to him and he made a difference for them. And so one question I have is, how many times do we let the enemy get to our doorpost before we, in utter defeat, turn to God? It was interesting. They were telling us in the program Thursday night, they have documented, they've gone to the places in quite a number, maybe more than 100 places worldwide, where community transformation by the outpouring of God in a community because of their crying out to him had made a difference. How many of those do you suppose happened in the combined areas of Europe and the United States? 2. Out of over 100 different events, the United States only had 2. Seems to me we've got enough problems in our country to cry out, but we don't seem to be on a large scale. How many times do we let the enemy into our homes through neglect of spiritual matters and then wonder why things aren't going very well? And is it not tragic, at least in my view of it, from my perspective, that it isn't until I start seeing in the results of my family leadership the work of the enemy before I realize how fully I've turned away from God and need to surrender, and have in fact otherwise surrendered to the Sennacheribs in my life. And so then you start seeing the results of that in your children. I am grateful. My son's been with me for 4 years now. Just me and him. He started off a really unhappy camper, and he's not the same as he was now. And I'm really grateful for that transformation. I'm really grateful for that. So we see God working. But nonetheless, we get some of what we didn't realize was going to be a problem. Wednesday's lesson, the rest of the story, according to Sennacherib, as reported in his annals, he took 46 fortified towns, besieged Jerusalem, and made Hezekiah the Jew a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. But in spite of his penchant for propaganda as an extension of his monumental ego, neither in text nor in pictures does he claim to have taken Jerusalem. From a human point of view, this omission is amazing, given the inexorable power of Sennacherib and the fact that Hezekiah led a revolt against him. Rebels against Assyria had short life expectancies and gruesome deaths. Scholars acknowledge that even if we did not have the biblical record, we would be compelled to admit that a miracle must have taken place. The fact that Sennacherib lined the walls of his palace without a rival with reliefs, carved him in pictures, vividly depicting his successful siege of Lachish, appears to be due to his need for a face-saving device, but for the grace of God, these pictures would have shown Jerusalem instead. Sennacherib did not tell the rest of the story, but the Bible does. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion, the zeal for the Lord of hosts shall do this. Therefore thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shields, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, and when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his sons smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So in response to Hezekiah's prayer of total faith, God sent him a message of total assurance for Judah that boils over with molten fury against the proud Assyrian king who had dared to defy the King of Kings. Then God promptly fulfills his promise to defend Jerusalem. That must have been some sight, wouldn't it, you think? 185,000 men just dead. Just didn't wake up.
Sure didn't smell good for a long time.
Yep. A big crisis calls for a big miracle, and big it was. The body count, 185,000. So Sennacherib had no choice but to go home, where he met his own death. Although the Bible record seems to make it seem like it indicates, or seems to give me the impression that upon arriving home, he went into his temple and his kings killed him. But the fact that there are carved reliefs proclaiming his victory in Lachish that were on his walls, it must have taken a little bit of time to be proud of himself before that happened. It seems like, because I don't know how anyone would have wanted to put those reliefs up on the wall in a dead king's honor. The God of the Hebrews had prevailed over the proud Assyrian. The honor of Jehovah was vindicated in the eyes of the surrounding nations, and in Jerusalem the hearts of the people were filled with holy joy. Also, if Sennacherib had conquered Jerusalem, he would have deported the population in such a way that Judah would have lost its identity, as northern Israel did. From one perspective, then, there would have been no Jewish people to whom the Messiah could have been born, and their story would have ended right there. But God kept them alive.
$185,000 bodies. We've seen almost 3 times that many in the United States in the past year. where they had to have refrigerated trailers to put the bodies in for a while.
Thursday's lesson is kind of a whole different story. Hezekiah gets told that he's going to die. Hezekiah doesn't want to die, so he cries out to God. God hears him and speaks to the prophet and says, go have a chat with him. Well, first the prophet told him he was going to die, didn't he? But in any case, Hezekiah decides that's not good enough, so he cries out and God hears him, sends the prophet back and says, okay, you're going to get 15 years. And then here comes one of those things that you just don't see coming. Have you ever had something happen in your life where you just did what you thought was the right thing for the moment? It turns out to have been a really bad idea. You know, someone comes to visit and instead of telling them about what God is doing for you, you show them other stuff. Man, I got a really nice motorcycle. You want to take a ride? Someone ends up dead, or, you know, goofy things.
It seems that Hezekiah believed that because he had done extraordinary things for the Lord and for his people, he deserved to live a little more. It's dangerous to think this, that we deserve something for what we did in the past, because we don't know what we can do in the future. The Lord knows us better. And if the Lord calls us to live more or to die, may the name of the Lord be glorified. Yesterday, with my wife, we went to Rome in Georgia to take a second shot for the vaccine. So we have now the vaccine Moderna completed. Do we have to trust in that vaccine or to trust in the Lord? We may die for another thing. So we have to do our best in order to live more and to do the will of God. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the Lord knows better when will be better for us to live or to remain. When we consider the last crisis, I was thinking that I will probably not fitted to bear that last crisis, and that the Lord will take me before the coming of the Lord. And if the Lord decides that I will remain alive, so I will hope that He will do a greater miracle, because I know that I am weak. Amen. So I leave this with the Lord.
It is dangerous to ask God for things sometimes, isn't it? The story of Hezekiah and the deliverance of Israel is one of a long line of stories in the Bible showing how our circumstances are so much determined and our troubles caused by our own decisions and the decisions of our fathers. It also illustrates how difficult it is for us to truly realize our present condition. Yes, Pastor?
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt your thought.
No, go ahead.
It's a point that it's interesting that in chapter 38 of Isaiah, it implies that what God had promised in the events recorded in chapter 37, the destruction of the soldiers, hadn't yet happened. by the time of Hezekiah's sickness. Because it says in chapter 38, Isaiah 38, after his sickness, God says, I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of Assyria and will defend this city. So it implies that the fulfillment of Hezekiah's prayer didn't happen just like that. There was some time there. And I think that's what we don't appreciate. These stories are so compressed here in the Bible, and we think people pray and immediately they get answers. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, in this case, of course, Isaiah gives assurance to the king, but the fulfillment of God's word, it takes a little bit of time. I mean, it doesn't happen instantaneously. So, thus, the need for us today, as we pray, those who wait on the Lord, I will renew their strength. The waiting and trusting, wait and trust and wait on the Lord. We've got to keep that in mind. We don't often get immediate answers to our prayers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me tell you that there are two theories of the time when Sennacherib came to Judah. One of them that our church adopted for a long time ago, taken from other theologians, indicates that Sennacherib came twice, 2 campaigns. The author of the lesson chose a theory or elaborated a theory that he came only once, and so he places the sickness of Hezekiah before that experience of the intervention of the angel of the Lord. I don't think so, that this happened in this order. Anyway, just to explain that there are two ways to look at the story that we are studying.
I don't know the chronology of that. That's a new idea. I have thought it was after the big event. But either way, I was impressed by the first part of that chapter where Hezekiah, given a death sentence, turned his face to the wall and wept sorely. I don't know, I can't judge Hezekiah, but our own strength may not be up to the task.
Well, one thing that I've learned from the seminar I'm going to this weekend is that the first thing in receiving the outpouring of God upon us is to recognize we need it. And if we have our head in the sand, if we're not willing to look at our situation, if we're not somehow aware of our situation, I mean, we're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, and we don't know it. And that's pretty much the nature of all of us as humans generally, is that we can't get God's help if we aren't aware of the direness of our situation. And, I mean, I don't know why Hezekiah seems to have waited until they got to his door to make preparations and deal with it, but then if the king was coming for some time in other places, probably those preparations are happening all along, because it takes time to build tunnels and build walls and do all those things. But are we paying attention to the signs in our own lives that might indicate that now would be a good time to throw our hands up in the air and say, God, I give up. Come in, deal with this. I've reached the end of my abilities. And I think that's important. So let's have prayer. Father in heaven, terrible stories of just incredible suffering and wretchedness, armies taking over whole countries and decimating them and carrying their people off and treating them like cattle, and yet you pay attention, you're aware, and when we turn to you, you hear us. So I ask you please to give us somehow the ability to recognize that we need you and to call out to you so that you can hear us. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.